The day I found the locket, everything I thought I knew about my life unraveled like a threadbare sweater. It wasn't tucked away in his pocket or buried in some drawer. It was right there in the garage, inside a carved wooden box I'd never seen before. Alongside it were birth certificates bearing our last name, documents for children I never knew existed. 50 years of marriage, and it turned out I wasn't Desmond's only wife. I was just the one with the money. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. For 50 years, I lived in a marriage that I thought was perfect. Desmond, my husband, seemed to be everything I could have wanted. Charming, intellectual, successful, and deeply devoted. We had built a life together in Cascadia Bay, surrounded by wealth and comfort, with a business that thrived under my family's name. Desmond was a well-respected marine biologist, and we had raised 2 children together. On the surface, our life seemed idyllic, but I had no idea that beneath it all, there was a secret, a betrayal that would shatter everything I believed. It all started when I discovered a wooden box in the garage, tucked away in the corner where it had no reason to be. The box was filled with photographs, letters, birth certificates, everything that connected my husband to a life I knew nothing about. I had been married to him for decades, completely unaware that Desmond had been living a double life. He had another family in Serenity Cove, a mere few hours away from our home in Cascadia Bay. Valencia, the woman I had never met, was the mother of Desmond's other children. This revelation hit me like a tidal wave. I couldn't fathom how I had been so blind. Desmond's lies had been so carefully crafted, so seamlessly woven into our life. He had managed to keep 2 separate families hidden from one another for decades, and I had been completely oblivious. How could he have done this? And how could I have missed it for so long? The more I uncovered, the more questions I had. What was his motivation? Why hadn't I seen the cracks before? I spent days in disbelief, trying to piece together the story of my own life and the truth about the man I had shared it with. Desmond had betrayed not only me but also Valencia, who had unknowingly shared her life with him. And as much as I wanted to rage against him, I knew the confrontation ahead wouldn't be about vengeance, it would be about understanding. I needed to hear from him. I needed to know how he had lived this dual life for so long without either of us suspecting the truth. I booked a room at the Harborview Inn in Serenity Cove. Desmond's other life had flourished there for so many years, and I felt it was time to finally face it. The plan was simple. I would meet Valencia and hear her side of the story. I needed answers, not just for myself, but for the years I had spent in this marriage. It was time to stop being passive in my own life and confront the man who had built our future on lies. As I checked into the inn, the weight of what I was about to do began to settle on me. I couldn't predict how it would go. Would Valencia be an adversary? Or would she, too, be someone betrayed, trying to make sense of what had happened? Whatever the answer, I knew one thing for sure. I had come to the point in my life where I needed to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Later that evening, I arrived at Valencia's home. The gentle sea breeze carried the scent of jasmine as I walked to her door. She greeted me warmly, and for a moment, I almost forgot the reason I was there. She was elegant, casual, yet dignified in a way that immediately set me at ease. There was no venom in her voice, no accusations, only an understanding that we were both in the same storm, navigating the wreckage of the man who had deceived us both. We shared a quiet dinner, seafood, a dish Desmond and I had often enjoyed, but now it seemed bittersweet. There was an awkwardness when I spoke of Desmond, and I noticed that Valencia seemed as guarded as I felt. But then, as we talked more about our own lives, our careers, our families, I began to realize how much we had in common. We were both women who had dedicated our lives to something meaningful, and though our paths had diverged because of Desmond, we weren't as different as I had thought. The conversation soon moved beyond Desmond. We spoke about our experiences, our passions, and the lives we had built independently of him. Valencia shared her pride in the Serenity Cove Marine Institute, the work she had done, and the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated field. I spoke about Luminina Wellness Center and the struggles I faced in finding my own purpose beyond the comforts of inherited wealth. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of connection, not just to another person, but to my own identity outside of my marriage. As I prepared to leave her house that night, I realized that I wasn't just facing Desmond's betrayal. I was confronting my own complicity in staying blind to the truth for so long. But now, things were different. I no longer felt passive. I had found a sense of agency in the midst of my heartbreak. Tomorrow, I would face Desmond, and I would no longer be the woman who stood by silently. The next day, I would meet Desmond in Serenity Cove, and the life he had built on deception would come crashing down. But for now, I was not alone. I had Valencia, and together, we would face the man who had shattered our worlds. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: the truth was finally going to come to light. I spent the night tossing and turning in my hotel room, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on me. The serene view of the harbor outside my window contrasted sharply with the chaos brewing within me. Desmond had built an intricate web of lies that had held together for 50 years, and today, everything would unravel. At exactly 3:30 p.m., I left my room and made my way to the Serenity Cove Marine Institute. It was a short walk from the Harborview Inn, but it felt like a lifetime. The calm rhythm of the harbor, the sound of the waves against the shore, and the distant calls of seagulls were nothing more than a backdrop to the storm raging in my chest. I had no idea what Desmond would say when he finally faced me, or Valencia, or their children, who would also be there. But I knew that this moment was the culmination of decades of deception. As I entered the side door of the institute, I was greeted by a young assistant who led me to the conference room. Valencia, Julian, and Eliza were already there, their faces a mixture of anticipation, anger, and perhaps disbelief. Julian stood near the windows, pacing, his body language reminding me uncomfortably of Desmond when he was agitated. Eliza sat at the conference table, her fingers drumming anxiously on its surface. Valencia, standing by the credenza with coffee and water, looked as composed as ever, but I could tell the tension in her shoulders. She was every bit the professional, even in the face of the personal upheaval that had brought us all together. "He's on his way," Valencia said as I entered, her calm voice a contrast to the nervous energy in the room. "He called from the rental car about 20 minutes ago." Julian turned from the window, his face tight with suppressed emotion. "Are we really doing this? Ambushing him like this? What would you suggest instead?" Eliza responded, her voice sharp. "A friendly family dinner where we casually mention, 'Oh, by the way, Dad, we've discovered you've been living a double life for half a century.'" Julian's expression remained troubled. "I'm just saying, there might be a less confrontational approach." Valencia stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Julian's arm. "I understand your concern, Julian, but this isn't an ambush. It's a reckoning. Your father made choices that affected all of us profoundly. We deserve the opportunity to face him together, to hear whatever explanation he might offer." There was a tense silence that followed, the reality of what we were about to do settling over us all. I looked around the room, noting the different ways each of us was processing this moment. Some with rage, others with resignation, and still, some with a sense of resolve. I couldn't help but admire Valencia for her calm, even in the face of everything. "Do we have a plan for how this conversation will proceed?" I asked, needing to take control of anything in this chaos. Valencia nodded. "I thought I would speak first, since he's expecting to see me. Then perhaps you, Talia, and finally the children, if they wish." The plan seemed simple enough, but I could feel the complexity of the situation weaving itself into the air. This wasn't just about Desmond, it was about all of us, the lives he'd affected, the secrets he'd kept, and the families he'd torn apart. Minutes passed, stretching out like an eternity. And then, at exactly 4:05 p.m., the footsteps outside the door finally arrived. Everyone froze. The door handle turned. And there he was, Desmond Merrick, my husband of 50 years, walking into the room. He was impeccably dressed, as always, linen trousers, a light sweater over a button-down shirt, loafers well-worn but polished. His silver hair was slightly wind-blown, and his amber eyes, those eyes I had spent a lifetime looking into, held a warmth that I knew was no longer sincere. His gaze swept across the room, and when he saw me, the blood drained from his face. For a long moment, he stood motionless, as if contemplating fleeing the room altogether. "Talia," he whispered, barely able to speak my name. It felt like a hollow echo. His voice trembled with something between surprise and guilt. "What are you doing here?" he finally managed, the question so inadequate to the moment that it almost made me laugh. I stood and met his gaze steadily. "Hello, Desmond," I said, my voice calm, despite the storm within me. "I believe we're all here for the same reason, to understand how one manages to maintain two separate lives for 50 years without either family suspecting the truth." His eyes darted between Valencia, me, and the children. There was something calculating in his gaze, a quick assessment of the room, as if he were trying to figure out his next move, to salvage whatever was left of his carefully curated world. "I can explain," he started, but stopped himself, recognizing the absurdity of those words. "Can you?" Valencia asked quietly, her voice steady despite the rawness of the situation. "Can you really explain deceiving two women for nearly half a century? Creating children with one while telling the other you didn't want a family? Building entirely separate lives in towns just hours apart?" Desmond closed the door behind him softly, the finality of it hanging in the air. He moved into the room, his legs unsteady, his posture slumped, as if the weight of everything had suddenly become too much for him to bear. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said, the words coming out with a sincerity that felt thin, almost empty. "And yet, here we all are," Julian interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Hurt, betrayed, questioning every memory, every story, every moment we thought was real." Desmond turned to Julian, pain flashing across his face. "Julian, you have to believe me. Everything with you and Eliza, with your mother, it was real. My love for all of you was genuine. I couldn't stop myself." "And what about your love for Talia?" Eliza demanded, her voice rising. "Was that genuine too? How does that work exactly, Dad? Loving two women simultaneously while lying to both?" Desmond's shoulders slumped. The confident posture he'd always maintained throughout his adult life seemed to collapse inward. He looked older now, diminished, as though the weight of his own lies had physically worn him down. "Please," he said softly, gesturing vaguely toward the chairs. "May I sit? This isn't a conversation I ever expected to have, but if we're going to have it, perhaps we could sit down." For a moment, no one moved. But Desmond, the man who had controlled every aspect of our lives, now seemed fragile, diminished in a way that was hard to reconcile with the man I had once known. With a glance from Valencia, we all sat down around the table, our chairs squeaking against the polished floor as we settled into the most surreal meeting of our lives. Desmond sat across from me, and I studied him. This man who had shared my life, my bed, my world for 50 years. Who was he really? The architect of an elaborate deception, or someone who had convinced himself that his lies were necessary? "I'm listening, Desmond," I said quietly. "We all are. If you can explain, now is the time." Desmond took a deep breath, looking around the room at each of us, his gaze lingering a moment longer on me. Then, with the weight of resignation in his voice, he began to speak. "I never planned for any of this to happen," he started. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table. "It began innocently enough. Talia and I had been married for 5 years when I first came to Serenity Cove for a research project. The marine ecosystems here were relatively unstudied, and the data was crucial for a habitat restoration program I was developing." He glanced at Valencia, his eyes softening slightly. "I met Valencia at the University Extension Office. She was brilliant, passionate about marine conservation in a way few people were back then. We worked together for weeks before things changed between us." "You mean before you decided to seduce her while concealing the fact that you already had a wife?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Desmond winced but didn't deny it. I told myself it was just a temporary connection, something that would end when the project concluded. But then you found out I was pregnant, Valencia finished for him, her tone flat, clinical. Yes, Desmond admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. When Valencia told me about the pregnancy, I panicked. I should have been honest with both of you then. But instead, I convinced myself there was another solution. A solution where you kept both women, both lives, both identities, I said bitterly. How convenient for you. Desmond met my eyes, and for the first time since walking into the room, I saw something close to remorse. It wasn't about convenience, Talia. I loved you. Our life together, the foundation we built. I couldn't bear to destroy that. But I also couldn't abandon Valencia or my unborn child. So instead of making a difficult choice, I chose not to choose at all. I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing his words, trying to piece together the fragmented version of the man I had shared my life with. This wasn't a man who had loved honestly, but a man who had convinced himself that his selfish choices were acts of love. Then you created an elaborate system of lies that lasted 50 years, Julian said, his voice rising with anger. How did you even manage it logistically? Desmond hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice now more matter-of-fact. My work provided the perfect cover. Marine engineering projects took me all over the world. No one questioned when I was away for weeks at a time. I established a consulting business that allowed me to control my schedule. I maintained separate communications for each life. Different phones, different email accounts, different stories. Different versions of yourself, I added, the words cutting through the air. Desmond nodded slowly, his face darkening with the weight of his own confession. The intricacy of his deception, the way he compartmentalized his life into neat little boxes, was both impressive and horrifying. Did you ever consider ending one of these relationships? Eliza asked quietly, her voice softer now. Was there ever a moment when you thought about choosing? Desmond's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. There were moments, yes. Times when the weight of the deception felt unbearable. But by then, the consequences seemed impossible to face. How could I suddenly tell either of you that our entire relationship had been built on lies? How did you even manage all of this? Eliza's voice trembled slightly, her anger now tinged with disbelief. 50 years. 2 families. A constant juggling act. I suppose I was afraid, Desmond replied, almost apologetically. Afraid of losing everything I had, everyone I loved. I didn't want to make a choice, so I chose to keep pretending. But now, it's all come crashing down. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. What was left now? What could any of us say? We had been living in a world of illusions, and now, it was time to face the truth. I leaned forward slightly. Well, Desmond, now that we know the truth, what happens next? His face fell further, his posture slumped. I don't know. But I'll accept whatever comes. The man who had once been my world, my partner, my everything, was now a stranger. And the future that lay ahead of me was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I would move forward. I would rebuild. And the first step was facing the truth, no matter how painful. And so we sat there together, united by the wreckage of the life he had so carefully constructed, each of us coming to terms with the shattered remnants of the man we had once known. The next few hours felt like they were unfolding in slow motion. Desmond, having finally spoken the truth, sat there in the silence that followed, his hands resting limply on the table. It was as though the room itself had become a courtroom, the weight of every word hanging over us, leaving none of us untouched. Valencia, Julian, and Eliza, who had all sat through this revelation with varying degrees of restraint, now exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Desmond had explained the how and why of his deceit, but the emotional damage couldn't be repaired by explanations alone. I was the first to speak, though my voice felt distant, almost foreign to me in the aftermath of everything. All of this, I began, my eyes briefly flicking to Desmond, then resting on Valencia and her children, has left me with more questions than answers. But the one thing I do know for sure is that I will not be a part of this anymore. Desmond's eyes lifted slightly, his expression tense. He nodded slowly, almost as if expecting this response. I saw his lips form a weak smile, though it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I still care about you, Talia, he said quietly, his voice wavering. I know you care, I replied, trying to suppress the bitterness threatening to spill over. But love doesn't work like that. You can't love someone and betray them at the same time. You can't keep two lives in the shadows and call it love. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, the sound jarring in the silence. The truth is, I can't even look at you the same way anymore. All of this, the lies, the deceit, the two families, none of it was about love. It was about control. You made decisions without considering the consequences for anyone but yourself. There was no response from Desmond. He simply sat there, shoulders hunched, clearly defeated. But his silence only deepened the rift between us. Eliza, Julian, I said, my gaze shifting to Desmond's children, I want to be clear that none of this is your fault. I know you both must feel like you've been living in a lie, too. And I'm sorry that you had to be a part of this. Julian, usually the calm one, stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the harbor as though seeking some kind of clarity in the vastness outside. Eliza, though, turned her gaze to me. There was a hint of vulnerability in her eyes, something raw beneath the anger. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding. It's been a lot to take in. But at least now, we have the truth. The truth. It hung between us all like an unspoken agreement. As painful as it was something we could no longer ignore. And yet, despite everything, there was a strange sense of finality that I hadn't expected to feel. Desmond's world of lies had shattered, and now, we were all standing in the aftermath, each of us trying to make sense of what remained. The room felt smaller now. The tension that had been thick like smoke seemed to dissipate as everyone took a moment to breathe. But still, none of us knew what came next. I'll handle the financial side, I said, breaking the silence once more. The divorce will proceed smoothly. I've already taken care of the legal work. There's nothing left to fight over. Valencia nodded, her professional mask slipping momentarily to reveal the woman who had been through her own share of grief. I appreciate everything you've done, Talia. It's been difficult, but I'm glad we've been able to handle this with some level of dignity. I smiled faintly. It's the least I can do. And honestly, I believe the money, our family's wealth, can still do some good. At least something positive can come from all of this. Desmond had been unusually quiet since our exchange. His fingers drummed lightly on the table in front of him as though contemplating the next words he might speak. Finally, after a long silence, he lifted his eyes to meet mine. I know I've lost everything, he said quietly. But if you can, just remember that there were good times, too. Our life, our marriage. It wasn't all lies. The words felt hollow, like a fading echo. I could hear the desperation in his voice, but I also knew that he was speaking to fill the empty space in the room, hoping that something would break through the walls we'd erected. I remember them, Desmond, I said, my voice softening. But I also remember the years of lies. The moments I spent wondering if something was wrong. The times I believed everything was fine when it wasn't. And that, unfortunately, is what I'll carry with me. There was nothing more to say to him. Not that day, not in that moment. So I turned toward the door, my hand resting on the handle. I'm leaving now, I said, the words feeling final. I have arrangements to make. You'll receive the divorce papers soon, and the financial adjustments will be taken care of. As I stepped out of the room, I could feel Desmond's gaze on my back, the weight of 50 years of shared history still lingering in the air behind me. I was no longer his wife, no longer part of his world. And in that moment, I understood what freedom felt like. Painful, yes, but liberating nonetheless. The next few days passed in a blur. I returned to my hotel, spent time with Valencia, Julian, and Eliza, and began to piece together what was left of my own life. The beach walks, the quiet conversations, the unexpected bonds that had formed amidst the wreckage. Each moment added a new layer to the complexity of this chapter in my life. The city was buzzing with the opening of Julian's restaurant, Tidderpool. The grand opening event was just days away. As I spent more time in Serenity Cove, I found myself unexpectedly drawn to the new connections forming. Ones not built on deceit, but on honesty, understanding, and a shared commitment to something greater than all of us. It wasn't just a restaurant opening, it was a chance to build something authentic from the ground up. Julian's work, Valencia's dedication, and the legacy of marine conservation were all being interwoven into the fabric of this town, and I was proud to play a small part in it. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to Serenity Cove more and more. Not just for the work, not just for the closure I had sought in the wake of Desmond's betrayal, but for the peace I was beginning to find there. I was learning to live again, on my own terms. I might not have the answers to all the questions about my past, but I did know one thing for sure. I was no longer defined by a man's lies. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. The weeks following the confrontation were filled with a quiet but steady sense of renewal. The once sharp ache of betrayal had dulled, replaced by the hum of ordinary life, familiar, grounding. I found solace in the small things. My morning walks along the harbor, the way the air felt in Serenity Cove, fresh, unburdened, like the sea had a way of cleansing everything in its path. The opening of Julian's restaurant, Tidderpool, was a turning point. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a symbol of everything that had been rebuilt in the wake of Desmond's unraveling. The night of the grand opening was buzzing with excitement, the air rich with anticipation. The community gathered, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a celebration of something real, something grounded in truth. I arrived early, as planned. The restaurant, a converted boathouse at the end of the pier, stood proudly against the backdrop of the setting sun. The warm amber light of the evening streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a glow over the pristine wood tables and the nautical-themed decor. The walls, adorned with vintage marine photographs and artifacts, gave the space a sense of both history and purpose. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was a reflection of all the values Julian held dear: authenticity, sustainability, and connection to the environment. Valencia was there, of course, standing proudly by her son as he greeted the first guests. I caught sight of her just as she was chatting with some of the local officials, her poised demeanor as always, though now there was an added softness in her expression, a relief perhaps that the storm of the past months was finally settling. Julian, ever the perfectionist, darted between the kitchen and the dining room, overseeing everything with a focused energy. When he spotted me, his face broke into a smile. It was a warm smile, free of the strain and tension that had marked our earlier interactions. "Talia, you made it," he said, crossing the room quickly to greet me. "I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're here tonight. You've really become part of the family in all of this." I smiled, touched by his words. "It's an honor to be included," I replied, looking around the space once more. "This place, it's beautiful. You've really brought it to life." "Couldn't have done it without a bit of help," he said, his eyes glinting with a mix of pride and humility. "And your support, Talia, really made all of this possible." As the evening wore on, I found myself surrounded by a community I had not anticipated forming part of. People from the Institute, local fishermen, conservationists, all gathered to celebrate the new chapter that was being written in Serenity Cove. It felt good, no, it felt right. To be here, among people who valued real connections over the masks that life sometimes demands. The evening flowed easily. Julian's food was everything he had promised. Fresh, vibrant, and perfectly balanced. The dishes told stories of local fishermen and the ecosystems that sustained them. There was one particular dish, a delicate crab salad, that had been sourced from one of the small fishing families supported by the Ashworth Foundation's conservation efforts. Julian had insisted on introducing me to the fisherman behind it, a quiet man with weathered hands and a grateful smile. It was small gestures like these that made me feel like the legacy I had helped to build wasn't just about wealth or prestige. It was about making a real difference. I spent time chatting with Eliza and Valencia, enjoying the relaxed pace of the evening. As we sipped wine, the tension that had defined our earlier interactions slowly melted away. In the midst of all the chaos that had surrounded us, we had found a way to be here together, united by more than just the complicated web of family ties. At some point, as I stood by the large windows watching the harbor come alive with lights and laughter, I realized just how much had shifted. There was a sense of peace in the air now. Desmond was no longer the center of our conversations, nor was he a shadow hanging over us. In some ways, it felt like a quiet victory, even though the scars of the past still lingered. We weren't free from the damage that had been done, but we were moving forward, piece by piece. The night ended on a high note, with a toast to new beginnings. As Julian raised his glass, I caught a glimpse of Valencia, her eyes bright with pride as she looked at her son. Despite everything that had happened, there was something profound in that moment. The knowledge that they had rebuilt, not just their lives, but something that was bigger than them. It was an act of reclamation, a way of turning pain into purpose. Later, after the last of the guests had left, I lingered in the restaurant with Valencia and Julian. We sat at one of the tables near the back, talking quietly about the future. The air was cool, but the warmth from the day's excitement still hung around us like a comforting blanket. "I've been thinking," Valencia said, her voice contemplative, "about what comes next for all of us. The Institute is growing, Julian's restaurant is taking off, and there's still so much work to be done in terms of conservation. But I've also realized that we need to start living for ourselves, too. Not just for the work, not just for the family, but for us. We can't let the past keep defining us." I nodded in agreement. It's been a long road, but there's still so much life ahead of us. So much to discover. Maybe it's time we finally start doing that, for ourselves. Julian, who had been quietly listening, raised his glass. To new beginnings, then. To real connections, the ones that matter. To new beginnings, I echoed, my glass clinking with theirs. The rest of the evening unfolded peacefully, and as I finally left the restaurant, walking back along the pier toward my hotel, I felt a sense of calm settle in my chest. The world hadn't stopped turning, but I had finally found my footing again. Desmond's shadow no longer loomed over my every step. The life I had once built with him had been shattered, but in its place, something truer was emerging. In the days that followed, I focused on my own path, returning to the wellness center, finalizing the details for the Ashworth Foundation's upcoming projects, and continuing my journey of self-discovery. I was no longer defined by the lies of my past. I was writing my own story now, and it was one I could be proud of. The months following the opening of Julian's restaurant, Tidderpool, continued to be transformative. Serenity Cove had become a second home, though not in the way I had once imagined. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching this small community thrive, especially when it came to the marine conservation projects I had helped establish. The work was difficult but rewarding, and the feeling that I was part of something genuine made all the difference. But it wasn't just the work that had shifted for me. The people here, Valencia, Julian, Eliza, had become more than just a lifeline. They were a source of new family, new connections that went beyond the shadow of Desmond. Slowly, we all found a way to make peace with what had happened, each in our own way, and each in our own time. I spent a few more weekends in Serenity Cove, moving between the Ashworth Foundation's projects and the research happening at the Marine Institute. But the most remarkable thing, perhaps, was the way I had begun to connect with Valencia on a personal level. We still held our occasional, deep conversations about the past and the future, but there was a new openness between us. The anger, the hurt, those early walls we had built against each other, were no longer there. What had once seemed like a complicated rivalry now felt like something more. Something like respect. One evening, as we sat at the porch of Valencia's home overlooking the harbor, she looked at me thoughtfully, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the water. "You know," she said, "I never expected this. I never expected us to find common ground after everything. But here we are. You've become more than just Desmond's wife. You've become a friend." I smiled, surprised by the warmth of her words. It was strange, this bond that had formed between us. Strange, but also meaningful. I thought of the dinner we had shared months ago, the way we'd cautiously shared our stories and listened to each other. I thought of the trust that had slowly blossomed from the wreckage of Desmond's deceit. "I feel the same way," I said softly. "When I first came here, I thought I was only dealing with Desmond's betrayal. But I've ended up with so much more than that. A connection I didn't expect, and a future that feels a little bit freer." Valencia nodded, her silver-streaked hair catching the light. "You've rebuilt your life in a way I never thought possible, Talia. It's inspiring. I admire that." The words were simple, but the weight of them was clear. Valencia was acknowledging something she had once never thought would be possible, a new beginning for both of us. The fall brought with it a sense of closure. The marine conservation initiatives were thriving. The trust for Valencia and her children had been firmly established, and I'd made arrangements to ensure they were supported financially moving forward. Desmond's absence had become more pronounced, but somehow less painful. The wounds were healing, though scars remained, as they always do. The day I made my first solo trip to the remote islands off the coast for a conservation research project, I felt a sense of independence that I hadn't experienced in years. There was something deeply fulfilling about navigating new landscapes, both physically and emotionally, on my own terms. I had finally stepped outside the comfortable constraints that Desmond's presence had always imposed on me. It was on that trip that I realized how far I had come in my own personal journey. The woman I was now was different from the one I had been at 73, standing on the edge of the truth about Desmond's double life. Back then, the world felt turned upside down. Now, as I hiked through the rugged trails of the island, I felt the solid ground beneath my feet again. Back in Serenity Cove, the holiday season approached with its usual charm. The small coastal town transformed with festive lights along the harbor and the scent of fresh pine filling the air. Valencia had invited me to join her and her children for Thanksgiving, and I found myself genuinely looking forward to it. We sat around a large table, not an elaborate family gathering, but one filled with laughter and shared stories. The simple, authentic moments, like the conversation about the different kinds of wild mushrooms Julian had foraged for the stuffing, felt like a true family gathering. It wasn't just about food, it was about connection, the kind that had been denied to all of us for so many years. As the evening wore on, I found myself feeling a deep sense of gratitude for these new relationships. For the chance to build something authentic with people who, despite everything that had happened, were capable of seeing past the betrayal. Later, as we cleared the table together, Eliza smiled at me, her voice soft. "I never thought I'd be here, with you, after everything. But I'm glad we're finding our way. It's not perfect, but it's real." I nodded, touched. Real is all we can ask for at this point. Valencia joined us, a glass of wine in her hand, her smile warm. "We've come a long way, haven't we? From the wreckage of Desmond's lies to this. A new kind of family." I raised my glass, offering a quiet toast. To new beginnings. As the years passed, I found myself increasingly drawn to the marine conservation work I had been helping to shape. The foundation had grown, and the connections I had made through it were far-reaching. But there were still moments when I thought about the years lost to Desmond's lies. Those years would never be fully regained, but they didn't have to define the rest of my life. Valencia and I continued our partnership, not only in the world of conservation but in life. Our friendship, rooted in shared loss and rebuilt with trust, had become one of the most unexpected blessings of my life. One morning, after an early walk by the water, I received a text from Valencia. "Thinking about starting a new initiative at the Institute. What do you think of a program for marine education aimed at young women in the local community? We could use your expertise." I smiled, the thought of the next step in this journey filling me with purpose. A new project, a new opportunity to continue reshaping my life and, perhaps, the lives of others. As I sat on the porch that morning, the light breaking through the clouds, I realized that what had been taken from me could never truly be replaced. But what had been rebuilt in its place was more than enough. I had found peace, and in its wake, I had found new beginnings, unexpected but real. And that was more than I could have ever asked for.